Hi everyone, Professor I here. I want to welcome you to my week 5 video, and the first thing that I'd like to talk with you about is the paper 2 assignment sheet. That's your first reading for this week. And so if you want to follow along with me by pulling it up, you can go to content and then to major paper assignments and related materials on the left hand toolbar there and look for paper 2. So for this paper, you're going to write an essay that is a compare-contrast. And what you're comparing and contrasting will be two of the following text of your choice that we're going to be studying together in this second unit. So you could choose from the book of Genesis, Creation by and from the Self, which is a creation story from India, Pangu and Nuwa, which is a Chinese creation story, Gaia, which is a creation story from ancient Greece, or What Really Happened in the Garden of Eden, which is a chapter from a book by Rabbi Harold Kushner. Excuse me. So you could choose two of those to compare and contrast. Alternatively, you might find a creation or origin story from another culture on your own, one that we're not studying together, and compare and contrast it with one of the texts that we are studying together. So those are the options that you have. Here are the important dates. Week 6, that's Monday the 28th through Sunday the 4th of October, we'll be holding what I call an idea workshop for paper 2, and that's where I give you a sheet. It's called an idea worksheet, and it sort of helps you to begin thinking about this paper and how you might want to approach it. So you can share your ideas initially for text choices, along with sort of gathering a sense of direction about how you might want to proceed. And you're not ever locked into the ideas that you choose on the idea worksheet. You can change your mind, but it is a way to begin. So to complete that assignment, you click on the Assignments tab up at the top of our Brightspace course page, and then you look for Idea Worksheet for Paper 1. And you'll follow the instructions there and upload your answers to those little Idea Worksheet questions before 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, the 29th of September. So that's the very first step in the process of writing Paper 2. And then the next thing is to create from those initial ideas a rough draft of the paper for peer review, and you want to submit that by 11:59 p.m. on Monday night, the 5th of October. And to do that, you would click on the Assignments tab again up at the top of our Brightspace course page. You would look for rough draft of paper 2 once you get to assignments, and you would follow the instructions there and upload your draft. And remember the policy, 10 points are deducted from your paper 1 grade if you do not upload a draft there before 11:59 p.m. on Monday night, the 5th of October. So it's very important for you to do that so that you can receive some feedback. This is done for your benefit so that you can improve your writing before you actually turn in the final draft of the paper. And that final draft of paper 2 is due on Monday, the 12th of October, before 11:59 p.m. And to submit it, again, you go to Assignments, and you would look for paper 2 final draft. And remember the policy about final drafts. 10 points are deducted from your paper grade for every calendar day that that paper is late, including the day that it's due and weekends. And papers are not accepted after 5 days. They just automatically become a 0. And remember that if you don't turn in a major paper, it really hurts your grade in this class, because the bulk of the grade in this class is made up of the major paper assignments. So the specifics for paper 2, the paper should be at least 2.5 pages in length. If it's not, points will be deducted. So 2.5 pages. As always, typed, double-spaced in Times New Roman 12-point font with standard 1-inch margins. And so this time around, you must document both of the text that you're using to compare and contrast in MLA formatting You have to cite them both within the body of your essay, we call that in-text or parenthetical citation, and on a separate works cited sheet at the very end of your paper. And a third source that might comment on one or both of those two primary sources, or perhaps it might comment in general on creation or origin stories, is highly recommended. That's a good thing to do if you can find one. Your essay must conform, as always, to a formal academic structure. So you have your introductory paragraph with your thesis statement at the very end of that first paragraph. That statement, not a question, but a statement that sums up the main idea of your paper. And, then obviously you want the body of your paper and then the formal conclusion. You must email me if you do decide to work with an online tutor and are able to do that. Email me with some sort of verification from that tutor, verifying that you have worked with him or her in advance of turning in the final paper at some point, and I might give you some extra credit points for doing so. We're still sort of in the stages of trying to work all of that out, so that may change. Look for announcements about that. And the objective of this assignment is twofold. First, to compare these two origin stories that you're writing about. So what are their similarities? And then to contrast them from each other. So what are their differences? And so to create a successful compare-contrast essay, here are the questions that you want to be asking yourself as you're writing. Do you open your essay with a hook that makes your reader want to keep reading? And we've talked about that before. So that hook is just a first sentence or so that makes your reader be interested in what you're writing about. So it could consist of a question. It might be a quote that is interesting. If it's a quote, you want to make sure you cite it because MLA citations required this time. And if it's a question, you want to make sure you're not using first person I and me or second person you and your, but you're restructuring the sentence to avoid that because this is formal college writing. Have I clearly stated the titles of the two texts I'm writing about and the author's full names in my opening paragraph? So when we get to the end of paragraph 1, we need to know what it is you're writing about, which two texts you're comparing and contrasting, and the author's names who wrote each of those texts. Have I referred to the authors by last name only after mentioning their full names in my opening paragraph? So again, that's protocol for all college writing across the board. It does not matter what the discipline is, whether it's history or, English or philosophy or whatever it is. When you mention someone, first mention that person by full name and then mention that person by last name only. That marks you as a professional academic writer. And note that citing the Holy Bible and mentioning its authors would entail the use of different rules in MLA. And you can find those rules in your little Siegel handbook. I can also assist you with that. Ask yourself, have I clearly stated my thesis, the main idea, the main claim that you're trying to get to here in your paper at the end of my very first introductory paragraph? So your thesis needs to make a claim about how these two texts might be alike and or different from one another. And your thesis might also provide some sort of insight for your reader as to what one might learn through those similarities and those differences. Have I quoted passages from both texts I've chosen in order to illustrate their similarities and differences, citing the quotes correctly in MLA formatting? Have I made certain to avoid using first person I and the words you or your throughout my essay unless they're part of quotes, choosing instead to use one or ones or to restructure your phrasing somehow there? Have I used transition words and phrases so the reader can more easily follow my thoughts? And note that one of your readings for today is transitional and linking verbs. And so when you read that, it's going to be very helpful to you in understanding how to do that. Have I used sentence variety in my essay? So as we mentioned before in a previous video, you want to vary the length and the arrangement of your sentences. So you don't want to have like a bunch of short back-to-back really choppy sentences, and you don't want to have a bunch of long drawn-out sentences back-to-back. Your writing needs to have sort of a flow and a rhythm, so you want to vary the sentence structure. Have I used language appropriate for a college level paper, or does my language feel too informal and too conversational? So if your language is super informal and conversational, you're going to get points deducted. You want to avoid words like stuff, right? And guy and thing. You want to define the thing. You want to use formal language. Have I organized this paper in a logical fashion? Have I carefully checked my essay for typos, for spelling, grammatical, mechanical errors? Have I asked someone else to read my essay and offer feedback? Have I met that minimum 2.5 full page length requirement to avoid point deductions? And does my essay contain some insight regarding the significance, the meaning behind those similarities and differences? So in other words, why would they be important? Why do they matter? How do the similarities and differences of these creation stories maybe impact the culture from which they come, or impact our thinking today? And again, as always, on a major paper assignment sheet, you'll see the Tennessee Board of Regents student learning outcomes to be evaluated there. And there's a separate sheet about that in the same section of Brightspace, should you be so inclined as to want to read that sheet and develop a better understanding. So our other readings, as we're entering Unit 2, Stories of the Other, and this is all about origin stories from different cultures, creation stories, include the book of Genesis from the Holy Bible, with which many of you will be familiar. That creation of, by, and from the self, a creation story from India. And then the other readings are transitional and linking verbs, as I mentioned a moment ago, and attribution, incorporating sources with signal words, which is a very important technique that we need to think about and learn in order to be good writers. So let's take a look right quick at the transitional and linking verbs. And to do that, we would go to course documents, and we would have to hit load more, and then we would eventually come to transitional and linking words. So as you'll see if you're following along with me, transitions between paragraphs and thoughts are really important when you're writing college level papers or anything else for that matter. So think of the first sentence of each paragraph, and by the way, we call that the topic sentence, because it tells your reader what the topic of that paragraph is probably going to be about, right? So think of that first sentence like a connector, sort of like a link in a chain. And that connector sometimes will look backward to the previous paragraph and forward to the current paragraph that you're just beginning. And so here are some transitional words on the sheet that I offer that will help you switch smoothly from one thought and or one paragraph to the next, so that your reader follows you more easily. So words that add information, you'll see those there, like in addition, furthermore. If you're concluding, finally, in summary and conclusion. If you're contrasting two things, which we're doing in this paper, you're showing a difference. You have words like conversely, and I used to love that back in my undergrad days. In fact, I had one professor who wrote in the margin of one of my papers, "Will you please," in big letters, "stop using the word conversely? It's the only word you use to transition. You're driving me crazy." So you don't want to overdo it. But however, counter to, on the contrary, terms like that. To show similarities, which we're doing in this paper, similarly, concurrently, likewise, in the same way. To offer or introduce a claim, therefore, for this reason, as a result. And this is a sheet that comes from the department, and you see I argue there. but you don't want to use that I in college level writing. So rather you would say one may argue that. And why in the world they put that on there, I don't know. But you want to scratch through that. To emphasize a point, indeed, to emphasize, in fact, to repeat, and to clarify, that is, to clarify, to make clear. So good opening lines and strategies in an academic paper, you might ask an intriguing question. What makes Waiting by Thun Hale a short story that remains powerfully poignant to individuals from varying backgrounds and places of origins? So that's one way to sort of begin. Ask the reader a question. You could use a quote from the writer whose work you're analyzing. In her poem Immigrants, Pat Mora asked the following question. Will they like our boy, our girl, our fine American boy, our fine American girl? And you see that you've put the quote from Mora in quotation marks, and that it's part of the sentence. It doesn't appear as a sentence all by itself. Otherwise, it'd be a dropped quote. And that in parentheses, you have the line numbers, because this is actually a poem, 12 through 14. And then you have your period after that last parenthesis. You might start with a surprising fact. Jose Antonio Vargas focuses readers' attention on what life is like for someone who is an undocumented immigrant, yet in doing so, he bravely reveals the truth that he, in fact, is undocumented, which puts him at serious risk of being deported from the U.S. And you see a couple of other examples there of how to begin. What are some horrible opening lines that you should avoid at all costs? Throughout human history, from the beginning of time, it's a 2.5-page paper. You don't have time to talk about the whole history of the world, right? Waiting is a very beautiful text. Very is an unnecessary word. It's fluff. You don't need it. Ditch it from your writing, always and forever. No very, no really. Beautiful is a vague word. It's not specific. Think about how waiting is beautiful. How are you finding beauty in it? Be specific. Good writing is about specificity. Never use the word you. Don't ever use it, ever, unless it's part of a quote. Use one instead. Here's a horrible example. You will really enjoy Waiting because it has great ethos. Hear how informal that is? We've got you, second person. We've got really, a fluff word like very. It has great ethos, right? So think, how is the use of ethos great exactly here? What makes it great? Here's a good example. One, not you, one can derive meaning from Waiting because of its effective use of ethos in presenting the writer as a credible, trustworthy narrator. So those are just some good things to know about transitional and linking words. And now look with me right quick at the sheet about attribution, and it is also found under course documents. Attribution, incorporating sources with signal words. So you know what that word attribute means, right? So if I'm going to attribute something to someone, that means I'm giving them credit for having originated that idea or those words. So attribution just refers to the introduction of your sources when you're incorporating them into your writing. And it shows your reader that your evidence or that the ideas you're using, that they're coming from identifiable, reliable sources. And sometimes the attribution might even contain the name of the book or the piece that you're writing about and the author's credentials, especially if it's the first time you're introducing that source. So here's an example. Literary critic Clive Austin, the author of Mark Twain Revealed, explains that Twain's greatest strength lay in his humor. So rather than just saying Clive Austin said Twain's greatest strength lay in his humor, if we said that, your reader doesn't know who Clive Austin is from The Man in the Moon, right? That means nothing to your reader. But now we know what he does. He's a critic of literature. He's an expert in this field. So you've established your own ethos, showing your reader, hey, I'm quoting from someone who's an expert in his field. And we know what he wrote. He wrote a book about Mark Twain. So clearly he knows his material, right? Note that you don't need to place Austin's last name in parentheses along with the page number where you found that quote, because you've already listed his name in your attribution in your sentence introducing that quote. If you had just said, a literary critic who was the author of Mark Twain Revealed explained that Twain's greatest strength lay in his humor, and you didn't name Clive Austin in your sentence, then in parentheses you would need Austin 49, right? So here's the golden rule. Never, never, never just drop a quote into your prose without indicating why it's there in some way and without incorporating that quote into your writing. And here's the big time golden rule. If a quote appears all by itself as a sentence in your paper, you have dropped it. And you will get major points deducted. It cannot appear all by itself as a sentence. You've got to integrate it into a sentence of your own so that it's not standing all by itself. Doesn't matter whether your quote fell from heaven or rose up from hell. Don't drop your quote. You've got to incorporate it. And the easiest way to do that gracefully is with what we call signal phrases or signal words, which serve to link up that quote with your ideas and with your sentence and to name the author of that quoted material. So here's an example on this sheet, hopefully you're following along with me, of a dropped quote. Some experts feel that the drinking age should not be lowered to 18, period. Quote, studies indicate that the brain is not fully developed until one reaches his or her mid-20s, unquote. And then in parentheses, you have the author's last name, Stein, the page number, 88, where that quote came from, the end parenthesis, and then the period. And that part is correct. In MLA, you always want the author's last name and the page number in parentheses. And then the period does not come at the end of the quote. It comes after the last parenthesis because that's now the end of your sentence, right? So that quote appears all by itself as a sentence, and it's dropped. It is dropped right in the middle of the writing. There's no real introduction to it. So you've got to avoid that by introducing the quote, by explaining to the reader who's speaking what's happening, why it matters. And so now here it is integrated. Some experts feel that the drinking age should not be lowered to 18, quote, studies indicate that the brain is not fully developed until one reaches his or her mid-20s. So the thing is, if that colon there had been a period, that quote would have been dropped because that quote would have appeared all by itself as a sentence. Does that make sense? So the colon prevents you from dropping the quote, but you can only use that colon method when your sentence before the quote, your phrase, before the quote comes in, is a complete sentence or an independent clause. If it's a dependent clause, if it's just part of a sentence, then you can't use the colon, you'd have to use a comma. So a much better way to eliminate a dropped quote would be to establish ethos and provide your reader with full information explaining to the reader who this Stein person is, what his credentials are, right? So some experts feel that the drinking age should not be lowered to 18. For example, Harold Stein, an acclaimed researcher in the field of brain development, advocates that, quote, studies indicate that the brain is not fully developed until one reaches his or her mid-20s, unquote. Now we know who this man is and why he's an expert in the field. So you can use these signal words and phrases to introduce quotes that support your view. You can use attribution to establish the credibility of those you quote. And here's an example, the emboldened type, as Germaine Greer, a doctor of psychology and expert in the field, writes, and then you have a quote from her. You can use these kinds of words to extend an argument, and the emboldened part indicates that. For instance, as Greer argues, you can use them to challenge someone else's argument. While Greer claims that blank, one could argue that blank, right? There are all kinds of signal words that you can use, and I give you a few there. Acknowledges, concludes, replies, agrees, remarks, right? All of those words are so much more interesting and informative to your reader than Greer says, because that doesn't tell us anything about how Greer is feeling when she says it, right? It doesn't tell us anything about her stance on this idea or this issue. And for goodness sake, don't say it tells us that or it says in the text. What is it, right? Don't do that. So remember, you can certainly disagree with a reading or an idea, but you can also agree with it. You can challenge it, problematize it, extend the argument, discuss its implications, propose a solution or a new idea, all sorts of things that you can do in college level writing. And I give you some templates here that you can actually use in your writing for each of those scenarios. And here's a template for introducing a quote for the first time. So you can actually take this and use it in your paper. According to blank, the name of the writer, comma, and then blank, the person's credentials, and then the quote, and then the page number. So you just plug your info into that template. According to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader and clergyman, the purpose of the Direct Action Program was, quote, to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. Now, if you're going to introduce a paraphrase, it's the same thing. And what is paraphrase again? That's taking someone else's words and putting them into your own words. Remember when we wrote summary and response, also called a summary and paraphrase? Because you're responding, you're putting that person's ideas into your own words as you're summarizing and responding. So you just plug the info in again. Now, there are certain rules for paraphrasing a direct quote. You're taking that direct quote, you're putting it into your words. You want to avoid repeating the same kind of wording that the source that you're quoting used in that quote, if at all possible. Sometimes it isn't possible. So, for example, there's really no other name for the Direct Action Program other than the Direct Action Program. But notice how the paraphrase here that I've given you in the example changes most of the other wording. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., author of Letter from a Birmingham Jail, tells us that the Direct Action Program's goal was to bring about a situation so filled with calamity that it would invariably become the catalyst for cooperation. So all the wording was changed except for situation. And you could even change that to experience, for example, right? So as with all things in good writing, you want to avoid monotony, avoid repetition. You do not want to repeat the same word or the same form of a word or the same phrasing, especially in close proximity. You don't want to do that because it breaks up the flow of your writing and it bores your reader to tears. So you want to vary the signal phrases that you're using to incorporate a quote. So in the words of, as so-and-so has noted, so-and-so points out that, right? You don't want to use the very same one every single time. And if you go back to course documents, you'll notice that I also give you a second sheet, Attribution Verbs handout, and it actually has a listing of all sorts of different attribution verbs that you can use. And it sort of divides them up into categories. So if the source is neutral, you can just use one like comments or observes. If the verb is conveying sort of layers of meaning, concludes, considers, discovers, shows, speculates, concedes. If the source is strongly arguing, you can say, Rabbi Kushner alleges that, or Rabbi Kushner insists that. If the source agrees with someone or something else, agrees, concedes, concurs, etc. If the source is disagreeing, you can use words like condemns, warns, laments, disagrees. And all of this is so much better than says. It sounds a lot more polished, and it shows your reader so much more about the stance of that person that you're quoting. So these are just important ideas, and after you've done your readings and listened to this video, then you want to post in the Week 5 discussion board. And this week the topic is comparing, contrasting this week's readings. So we're actually going to compare and contrast the book of Genesis with creation by and from the self. So we're doing in this discussion board exactly what you'll be doing in paper 2. And then the second topic in this week's discussion board is attribution. So you'll actually be choosing and using some signal words like we just talked about. So thanks for your patience in listening to me. Next week, we're reading Pangu Nuwa, which is a creation story from China. We're reading Gaia, which is one from ancient Greece, and there's a little diagram of the ancient Greek gods that you can look at. And then we're looking at Rabbi Kushner's chapter excerpt from his book, How Good Do We Have to Be? His interpretation of the Eden story. And there's a cool documentary that I'm going to ask you to watch next week. It's an excerpt from the story of God creation. And it's just absolutely wonderful. It's narrated by Morgan Freeman. And then there's a very short film, very short, Prayer for the World by Rabbi Kushner, a prayer that he wrote. And then we'll be comparing and contrasting in the discussion board those readings. So we'll be doing again in the boards exactly what you'll be doing in paper 2. Thanks for your patience, guys. Have a great week.